listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio. The Blessed Woman. Learning about grace from the women of the Bible.
Chapter 6. Don't miss out on the miracles. Maintaining an attitude of grace under pressure. Earlier, Moses had sent his wife, Zipporah, and his 2 sons back to Jethro, who had taken them in. Exodus 18, verse 2. You think we should do what? Zipporah's words hung in the air like smoke from a freshly kindled fire. Her eyes sparkling with fury, she hugged baby Gershom tighter to her chest and glared at Moses. Clearly, this was going to be a long night. Sighing, Moses rubbed his forehead with his fingertips. He was exhausted already, and the conversation had barely begun. I promise it won't hurt him, he said. Hebrews have been circumcising their boys for hundreds of years. Well, I'm not Hebrew, Zipporah stiffened at the thought. What's more, our son is not a slave, and I don't want him identified as one. The stubborn set of his wife's jaws stopped Moses from reminding her of his own Hebrew heritage. She preferred to think of him as a former prince of Egypt. It had always been a sore spot between them. Determined to be patient, he reminded himself how strange this whole concept must seem to a Midianite, and tried again to reason with her. Sweetheart, you know circumcision isn't a sign of slavery. It's a sign of our covenant with God. You can call it whatever you want, she interrupted, her voice icy with finality. But as far as I'm concerned, it's barbaric. And if you think I'm going to agree to it, you are out of your mind. Zipporah whirled on her heel and stormed out of the tent, clutching their son in her arms. Moses watched her go without another word. Tongue-tied as usual, he wondered why he always lost such arguments. Why couldn't he just take charge? Why couldn't he just tell his wife, it's my way or the highway? I'm just too meek, he thought. Shrugging his shoulders, his palms upturned, he rolled his eyes heavenward. He had no idea how he would ever manage to please both God and his wife at the same time. Okay, I'll admit it. I'm dramatizing a little. The Bible doesn't really say such a conversation took place between Moses and Zipporah, but reading between the lines, we almost have to assume it did, probably more than once. The discussion might not have unfolded exactly that way, of course. I guessed about the details, but one thing is certain. By the time Moses set out with his wife and sons to free the Israelite slaves, circumcision had long been a topic of debate. And apparently it was a debate Zipporah refused to let her husband win. Considering everything she had put up with as a wife, her resistance was reasonable. From the very beginning, married life with Moses had been a wild ride. The surprises had started early. The first day she met him, when he showed up at the well and rescued Zipporah and her sisters from the water-stealing shepherds. He said he was an Egyptian, a tall, dark stranger. He swept her off her feet. Then she married him, only to find out he wasn't really Egyptian at all, but a kind of cultural hybrid, an Israelite slave by birth, raised as royalty in Pharaoh's palace. What a confusing combination. If that wasn't weird enough, he turned out to be a fugitive running from the law because he had killed an Egyptian for mistreating a slave. Moses tried explaining the murder by saying he had a sense that his destiny was to deliver the Israelites from the cruelty of bondage. Zipporah was relieved to learn he had abandoned that idea after burying the dead Egyptian in the sand. No question, it was a lot for a wife to swallow. But for years, Zipporah did her best. Putting Moses' troubled past behind her, she told herself they could just live a normal Midianite life, and for a while they did. Then Moses came home from work one day with some wide-eyed tale about a perpetual burning bush that talked with the voice of God. How was she supposed to respond to such a story? "Oh, how nice, dear. I'm glad you had an interesting day." She did try to be understanding, heaven knows. Although Moses was odd, he was also a good, humble man. That's why she was so shocked when he told her he wanted to go back to Egypt and give the whole deliver the Israelite slave thing a try. She wondered right then if he had totally lost it. As gentle as possible, she pointed out that it's not usually wise to go back to a place where you're wanted for murder, especially with the intention of causing further trouble. But Moses just kept telling her God said it would all work out and that he would go with them to make sure it did. The God in the bush, dear, that's the God who's going with us to Egypt? Yes, he said. Then he reminded her again they should circumcise the boys before they made the trip. Although Zipporah agreed to go back to Egypt with Moses, she put her foot down on the issue of circumcision. She didn't like it, and she wasn't going to go along with it. Moses gave in to her, hoping God would understand. As it turned out, he didn't. He was so provoked by Moses' disobedience that as the family journeyed to Egypt to deliver the Israelites, or as Zipporah thought to face certain annihilation at the hands of Pharaoh, it came to pass on the way at the encampment that the Lord met Moses and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at Moses' feet and said, "Surely you are a husband of blood to me." Exodus 4, verse 24 through 25. Before I thought through this story, I was totally baffled by Zipporah's response. I couldn't figure out how she came up with circumcision as the answer. I certainly wouldn't have. If Robert and I were on our way to church and God started threatening to kill him, not in a zillion years would I guess that I could fix the problem by circumcising my sons. But Zipporah, even though she was a Gentile raised in a culture unfamiliar with the practice, didn't have to think twice about it. She knew right away what God wanted. How did she know? Her Hebrew husband had told her, and told her, and told her how important circumcision was. They had numerous conversations about it that always ended with Zipporah saying no. On the road to Egypt, however, her no changed to yes. Realizing she didn't have any other choice except widowhood, she gave in. Her patience spent, her nerves frayed, her grace meter on empty, she kept the letter of the law but violated the spirit of it. She did the right thing with the wrong attitude and proved that it does not bring about the desired results. Hurtling at Moses' words as sharp as the stone in her hand, she threw the evidence of her obedience on the ground in front of him and said, "What a blood-smeared husband you turned out to be." Verse 25. Proverbs 11:16 says, "A gracious woman retains honor, and apparently an ungracious woman gets sent home." That's what happened to Zipporah anyway. After what I assume was a very ugly argument, one of those where nobody sleeps at night, Moses decided she shouldn't accompany him to Egypt, so he sent her back to Midian to her father's house, where she remained until Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, heard about everything God had done for Moses and his people, the Israelites. He heard especially about how the Lord had rescued them from Egypt. Earlier, Moses had sent his wife Zipporah and his 2 sons back to Jethro, who had taken them in. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came to visit Moses in the wilderness. He brought Moses' wife and 2 sons with him, and they arrived while Moses and the people were camped near the mountain of God. Exodus 18, verses 1 through 2 and 5. Just think about everything Zipporah missed. While she moped around at home drawing water and baking bread, her husband was making history. In the prime of his ministry, he was working with God to bring the world's most powerful nation to its knees. Zipporah could have been there to see it all, the plagues plaguing, the Red Sea splitting, the Israelites marching through on dry ground, and the Egyptian army drowning behind them. She could have been witness to the most epic signs and wonders God has ever wrought on planet Earth. But she missed it. All because of a lousy attitude. All because she didn't respond to a challenging situation with grace. A night in the Amarillo airport. Despite her faults, I love Zipporah. She gets me thinking about how much my bad attitudes can cost me. She reminds me of what I'll miss out on if I choose to be grouchy instead of gracious when things aren't going right. There will always be times when things don't go right. You are aware of that, aren't you? Jesus himself warned us about it. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. John 16, verse 33. Sometimes I seem to forget that statement is in the Bible. I'll have a bad day and react with astonished resentment. Contrary circumstances will catch me off guard without even having an excuse as good as Zipporah's. I'll get very cranky. I'm grateful to be able to say it happens less and less these days. To God be the glory, I assure you. But every once in a while, it still occurs, sometimes in a big way, like it did one terrible night in the Amarillo International Airport. I refer to the airport by its official title because on this particular evening I arrived there so exhausted from ministry travel and so desperate to be home that even part of the name of the place seemed designed to annoy me. International? They had to be kidding. Maybe it was because the hour was late, but the place was practically a ghost town. The same woman who issued us our tickets and checked our baggage showed up at the boarding gate to put us on the plane. I was not in the frame of mind to give that woman a break either. Regardless of how many tasks she had to attend to, I wanted her to be quick and efficient at all of them. She probably was, but my weariness warped my perception, and she appeared to me to be moving in slow motion. Instead of attending to us at the ticket counter with a couple of clicks on her computer and whisking us on our way, she left us standing there, waiting, and waiting, and waiting. Internally, I begged her to hurry. Please, just give us our tickets. All I want to do is sit down. When we went through airport security, the pace slowed even further. Tapping me on the shoulder, the screener motioned me aside for a special screening. If it was indeed supposed to make me feel special, it failed. After being patted down and intruded upon in a myriad of irritating ways, I emptied out my purse and watched a stranger paw through the contents. Finally, I was waved through the boarding gate. I can't remember if I've ever been happier to see a chair than I was that night. Cherishing the thought of collapsing into it and awaiting the blessed announcement that our plane was ready to board. I was about to sit down when Robert intercepted me. Let's go over and check with the woman at the gate to see if there's anything else we need to do before departure, he said. I looked at him like he'd suggest we race laps around the airport. Couldn't he see how tired I was? I didn't want to walk another step. Honey, we have our tickets. Let's just sit down. No, come on, let's go check it out. Just in case. Heartless man, determined to do the right thing, follow my husband's instructions. I did it with the wrong attitude that became even more wrong when I realized the woman at the gate was the same one who had served us, snail-like, at the ticket counter. Oblivious to the tick, tick, tick beside him, the clear warning that his wife-turned time bomb was threatening to explode, Robert smiled and asked his question, "Is there anything else we need to do?" Long pause. It wasn't a hard question, but the woman hesitated anyway. Then reaching down to retrieve something from behind her desk, she finally answered, "Yes." Yes? Did she say yes? I can't believe it. What else could she possibly want us to do? Fill out another form? Volunteer to pass out pretzels on the flight? I couldn't take one more thing. My Zipporah moment had arrived. Gathering some sharp words, I was about to let them fly when I looked down to see what the woman held in her hand. It was a copy of Robert's book, The Blessed Life. "Will you sign this for me?" she asked him. You've probably seen those nature shows on television where a frog snags a gnat with the flick of his tongue and gulps it down faster than the human eye can see. That's what I did with my unspoken words. In the blink of an eye, I swallowed them. Then I silently thanked God nobody ever heard them. I still cringe to think what it might have cost if someone had. A Pharisaical pitfall. How do we avoid these kinds of Amarillo airport moments? How can we make sure we respond with grace when things go wrong? The Apostle Paul gives us the key. So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their heart. You, however, did not come to know Christ that way. Surely you heard of him and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds. Ephesians 4, verse 17 through 18, and verses 20 through 23. Look again at that last phrase, be made new in the attitude of your mind. That's something we absolutely must do if we want to respond graciously when we're under pressure. We must renew our attitude with a revelation of grace. We must not only know what grace is, we must have an experience of it, an understanding of what it's done and continues to do for us every single day. In other words, to extend grace to others, we must first become aware of how much grace we've received. But don't most of us already know that, you might ask? Yes, to some degree we do. We know it's by grace we're saved. We know it's by grace we're forgiven of all of our sins, the big ones and the small ones. By grace, God accepted us when we didn't measure up, poured out his unmerited favor upon us, and provided a better future for us. By grace, the Almighty King, creator of heaven and earth, laid down his royal robe, came to earth, lived a perfect life, and suffered a painful death just so he could have a relationship with us. As Christians, we're fully aware that our spiritual debts have been paid by grace. The problem is, most of us have no idea how much we owe. We're like the Pharisee who invited Jesus over for dinner. He was so clueless about his own spiritually impoverished condition that he extended no grace to the prostitute who barged into the house to minister to the master. As she washed Jesus' feet with her tears, dried them with her hair, and anointed them with her precious perfumed oil, the Pharisee reacted with Zipporah-like irritation. "She's a sinner," he fumed, implying, of course, that compared to her, he didn't qualify as a sinner at all, and even if he did, his sin was clearly much less sinful. Luke 7, verse 39. Startling as it might sound, we sometimes think the same way, and I certainly did. For years, I assumed that because I had gotten saved before I had time to do anything breathtakingly terrible, it didn't take as much grace to save me as it took to save world-class sinners like Robert. Because my sin seemed relatively minimal, I figured God had expended a minimal amount of forgiveness on me. I was most happy about that. I did fret about it sometimes, though, especially when I'd look at Robert and see his love for the Lord. His passion always seemed much greater than mine. Trying to figure out why, I'd think of the Pharisee and how. Jesus answered and said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." So he said, "Teacher, say it." There was a certain creditor who had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50, and when they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him more? Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And he said to him, You have rightly judged. Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Luke 7, verses 40 through 47. For decades I thought Jesus was saying what I already knew to be true. Some people, like Robert, have big sin debts. Some people, like me, have little ones. And the big debtors will always love God more than the little debtors. Although the concept made sense, it frustrated me. So I began to pray, Lord, I want to love you as much as Robert does. The way God answered my prayer forever changed my perspective. He gave me a vision of myself wearing a pristine white wedding dress and running to meet Jesus. My heart was rejoicing knowing I was the bride of Christ, but in my hurry to reach him, I fell into a mud puddle. In an instant, my dress was ruined. My hair, my skin, every part of me was drenched with mud. Crouching on my hands and knees, I wept over my filthy condition. As I cried, the Lord revealed to me the reality of the filth in my own life. He showed me the inner rebellion and ungodly attitudes I had, even as a child. He showed me just how sinful I really was before I got saved. I'm so dirty, I sobbed. Then in the midst of my tears, I saw someone had stepped into the mud puddle with me. I looked at his feet, saw the nail prints, and realized it was Jesus, standing in the mud, yet still clean. He reached out his hand to me. As I took it, the mud that had covered me began to fall away. I stood up again as clean as the Master himself. Glancing back down at the mud puddle, I saw it had turned to gold, and together Jesus and I danced on the streets of gold. For the first time in my life, I understood the overwhelming grace God had extended toward me. But I'm not the only one who got the revelation. Sometime later, Robert got it too. One afternoon, he came running out of his study, waving his Bible and proclaiming the good news. Debbie, you aren't any better than I was before you got saved. I found proof of it in the Bible. You needed God's grace just as much as I did. Explaining he'd been reading the parable of the two debtors, he told me how he had realized both of them were in the same condition. They both owed. They both had nothing with which to pay, and they both were freely forgiven. The point of the parable isn't that some people are better than others, he said. The point is that although some people think they're better than others, we are all equally bankrupt before God. It's a truth the Bible confirms again and again. There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have altogether become unprofitable. There is none who does good. No, not one. Romans 3, verses 10 through 12. For there is no difference. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Verses 22 through 23. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. James 2, verse 10. Some people might consider those verses sad, but to me, they're thrilling. They tell me I've been forgiven of just as much as everybody else, which means I can love Jesus as much as anybody else on earth, including Robert. Celebrating every step of the way. Actually, now that I know how much grace I've received, I not only love the Lord with greater passion, I love people more too. Having experienced how gracious God has been to me, I have a heart to extend His grace to others. There was a time when I'd see a young lady walking down the street dressed in a way I felt was inappropriate, and I'd be judgmental of her. Without knowing anything about her situation, I'd assume negative things about her character. It never occurred to me she might have just gotten saved. She might be a baby believer, too busy learning the basics of God's love to worry about her wardrobe. Now I can see how legalistic and graceless my attitude actually was. I've come to understand God isn't looking at externals. He isn't focused on what people are wearing. He's looking at their heart. He's reaching out to them with love and acceptance, no matter how imperfect they might be. Just as Zipporah's ungracious attitude caused her to miss out on seeing the miracles of God, mine would have cost me the same thing if I'd hung on to it. My legalistic, judgmental perspective would have alienated people who were in the early stages of their pilgrimage with the Lord. Expecting them to advance spiritually from A to Z overnight, I would have missed the wonder of cheering them through the messy yet amazing growth process that takes place between B and Y. My disapproving attitude would have driven them away. I wouldn't have witnessed the miracles that happened as they took their first tiny steps toward God. I'm sure this is true of everyone, but it's especially true of women. Apart from God's grace, we tend to view ourselves either too highly, thinking we're better than others and standing above them, or too lowly, thinking others are better than we are, and using jealousy, gossip, and backbiting to pull them down. But when we see ourselves as extensions of God's grace, we're neither above nor below anyone else. We're just who we are, loving other women regardless how delightful or difficult they may be. We find beauty in them. We can celebrate their strengths and abilities without criticizing and without competing. I see it happening at Gateway more and more. Women supporting, honoring, and praising each other. Women rejoicing when it's someone else's turn to speak, lead praise and worship, or go on a mission trip. Women pulling each other into the spotlight and saying, "It's your moment to shine." As equal recipients of God's great grace, we are realizing that we don't have to feel threatened when we see a woman who's gifted in different areas than we are. Her strengths don't diminish us, and our strengths don't diminish her. On the contrary, we can benefit from each other, rejoice in our uniqueness, and reflect back to each other the grace we've all received from God. Is it really possible for women, as notoriously evil as we can be to each other, to maintain such an attitude? Yes! It is not only possible, but it's also what the Bible tells us to do. Philippians 2 verses 5 through 8 says, "You must have the same attitude that Christ had. Though He was God, He did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, He gave up His divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When He appeared in human form, He humbled Himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross." Just grab a spoon. Granted, sustaining a Christ-like attitude toward one another can be a challenge at times. As I've already mentioned and Zipporah has demonstrated, things don't always go the way we'd like them to. Sometimes we get tired and circumstances aggravate us. Sometimes people upset us, act unkindly toward us, or even persecute us. At those moments, we all wish we had an easy button to push that would make it more comfortable for us to dispense God's grace. But there's no easy button. Just as going to the cross wasn't easy for Jesus, extending grace when we're exhausted or hurt or frustrated won't always be easy for us. But by the power of God, we can do it if we predetermine that's the choice we're going to make, no matter the circumstances. A few years ago, before my daughter Elaine went off to college, Robert and I talked to her a lot about predetermined choices. We encouraged her to think through the situations she might encounter at school and asked, "Are you going to drink? How late will you stay out at night? What times will you set aside for studying? We knew she'd be better off if she made decisions ahead of time. That's not just true of college girls. It's true of every life-giving woman. We should pre-make our decisions to be extenders of God's grace. We should predetermine that if our husbands don't pick up after himself, and we know he won't, we'll be gracious about it. Thinking through the various possibilities, if someone is rude to us at church, our co-worker at the office criticizes our report, or our already svelte neighbor tells us, on a day we feel especially bloated, she just lost 10 pounds, we should decide beforehand we will respond with grace. Oh, what a difference such decisions can make. They can turn messes into memories and fiascos into fun. I saw it for myself the day my mom lost her grip on the pie plate when I was a little girl. I'll never forget it. She had spent the whole day cleaning house from top to bottom because guests were coming. Everything was ready except for the pie, one of those cream cheese affairs and a graham cracker crust with cherry topping. It was assembled but still needed to chill for a while. As my sister and I watched, mouths watering, my mom lifted the pie from the counter to put it in the refrigerator when tragedy struck. The pie slipped from her hands, took a tumble, and went splat on her sparkling clean floor. For one awful moment, all three of us stared at it in shock. Then, with great grace, my mom reached in the silverware drawer and took out 3 spoons. "Let's eat," she said with a grin, and we all sat down and had a pie party on the floor. Leaving enough cream cheese on the linoleum to protect us from germs, we ate all we wanted, cleaned up the rest, and had a great day. It's a memory I'll always cherish. And it happened because my mom chose to be gracious, not grouchy. She decided that instead of making a big deal of the mess, she'd do what Jesus would do if he ever dropped a pie, and covered the whole situation with forgiveness and love. Really, when you get right down to it, that's what grace is. It's doing for others what Jesus has already done for us. It's obeying the instructions in 1 Peter 4, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. When we arm ourselves in advance with the decision that we're going to follow Christ's example and suffer if necessary rather than act ungraciously, we put God's will above our own. We open the door for him to move in wonderful ways, not only in our lives, but in the lives of others as well. Sometimes the grace we extend will leave a small but lasting impression on others. It will do for them what my mother's pie party did for me. Other times, our graciousness will make the kind of major difference that changes a life completely. A few years ago, a well-known Bible teacher described such a time when she ministered at Gateway. She told us about a grace challenge she faced when she preached on the subject of divine healing at a particular church. The service went well, or so she thought, but after she finished her message, the pastor of the church stepped to the pulpit and refuted everything she said. She was stunned. She had asked him in advance about the teaching she planned to deliver, and he had given her his blessing. Sitting frozen on the front row, listening to him tell the congregation how wrong she was, she felt humiliated, betrayed, and angry. But in the midst of it all, the Holy Spirit spoke to her heart. "The message everyone will remember is the look on your face right now," he said. It was true, and she knew it. So instead of walking out in a huff as she so desperately wanted to do, she plastered a great big smile on her face. Do you know what happened next? To everyone's astonishment, the healing power of God broke out right there in the service. Remarkable healings took place. Miracles happened. Miracles everyone would have missed if one woman had responded with an attitude like Zipporah's instead of an attitude of grace.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.